This is Fam Electric Ghost, and we're on the air live with Jack Maher, and we're going to talk about um, your um, your information. Well, your Poppy, a novel about colorful Colorado life, and that's a bestseller. And we're going to get into that story. We also wanted to talk about one of the focuses for this episode is changing white attitudes toward Native American art. And so, welcome to the podcast. And how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great, Phantom. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
So, a couple of questions we usually ask any guest before we get to the heart of your story. Say, what motivates you and why do you do what you do?
I guess because I have that creative spark, I've always had it. And for most of my career, I expressed that spark through either journalism or filmmaking. And just most recently, it's been as a novelist. I've just always felt the need to put something new out in the world and then let the world decide if it was useful to them or not.
So, you're Colorado native. That you've mentioned, like your fifth generation, and grandson of Eric Douglas,
Mhm.
pioneering Denver art museum curator and a native arts champion. So maybe we can get to that part of your story. But you've been in worn a lot of hats, and I know we want
Yeah,
to talk about your book, but the story to how you got to your book. Do you want to tell that?
yeah, yeah, you bet. So growing up here in Colorado, I really didn't have a lot of information about this man, Poppy, Eric Douglas. He was my grandfather, as you said. And, I just was a typical kid. My focus was on other things. And also, I had a bit of a dysfunctional family. Growing up, we had some alcoholism, some mental illness. And so, really, just getting through the day and making sure that, I could kind of fake my way through school, that it was really okay, even though I hadn't slept the night before. That was really my main focus. And I'd heard bits and pieces about this man and the legacy that he had left behind at the Denver Art Museum. But it wasn't until my grandmother, who we called Baba, moved in with us and stabilized the dysfunction. She made sure that the rent was paid, that we had food and clean clothing. And there was this other part of her life that she just didn't really share a lot with us. And that other life was spent with this man who was a champion of Native American artists. And I guess I should explain how that all started. So his father was a priest, an Episcopal priest, and he loved creating music for the Episcopal Church, specifically hymns. And he helped write the hymnal that was used for many, many years, and many of his songs are still used in the Episcopal tradition. But he studied something called plain song, and I don't know if that is a term that you've ever heard of or are familiar with. But if you go into a religious setting and you hear monks chanting unaccompanied,
Hmm.
that is plain song. It goes back hundreds of years, and Eric's father made a study of this music and wanted to bring it into the Episcopal Church. And so that was his whole focus in life. And he did a lot of his ministry in the New York area. Well, he worked really, really hard on this, and he would just spend hours composing and trying to bring this music into a format that was acceptable to the church. But he overworked. And one day they found him at the base of his organ where he did a lot of his composition, and he was passed out. And he was just close to death because he just didn't take very good care of himself. He worked himself into this state. And his superiors, when they found this man, this priest, they realized we've got to make sure that this guy takes better care of himself. So they ordered him to leave the New York area and to come out west. And this was in the late 1800s. And at that time, a lot of people who were suffering various ailments, and a lot of it was lung disease, but there were other problems as well that a lot of doctors would prescribe for their patients to come out to Colorado and the blue skies and the clean air.
Oh, get away from the industrialization of the Northeast.
Yeah. Or in the case of this man, to maybe take the workload off for a little bit. So he came and he went to a sanitarium in Denver. And sometimes people will think of a sanitarium and they think, that's for mental illness, but it, at that time was also for physical problems. And this particular sanitarium was run by a woman named Josepha. And she was one of the first female doctors in Colorado. And I don't think that this man knew at the time what was going to happen, but the two of them hit it off. And because priests in the Episcopal Church, it's okay for them to marry.
Yeah.
They fell in love and they married. But as part of his rehabilitation, he ended up going on horseback through the great American Southwest. So he had, this traditional therapy at the sanitarium run by this woman named Josepha, but he also, on his own, went on a horse, took a bedroll, and just slept out under the stars.
Well, just went out in the world.
Yeah, in the world, and went out into the desert. And as part of that experience, he started encountering some of these native people, some of whom were artists. And they loved this man. His name was Winfred Douglass. And the Hopi in particular just had some sort of kinship with him. He didn't try to convert them. He realized that their world was their world.
So he respected their practice.
And he respected their culture, their art, their what they believed. But in the course of getting to know them and lived with them for 6 months, they adopted him and made him a blood brother.
That's awesome.
And they gave him a name, Tall Pine Tree is how it's translated from Hopi, because he was a very tall man.
That's awesome.
And so he just, came away from this experience changed. And so he and Josepha married. This love affair that he started with these Hopi people continued. And a lot of the art that he purchased from them, he used to decorate the home that they started up in Evergreen, Colorado, which is just an hour west of Denver. Mm-hmm. And it was a beautiful log home that started as a hay barn. And with the help of a very talented architect named Jock Spence, who was from Scotland and very skilled in boat building, and he took a lot of those techniques to build this lodge, this 17-room lodge, which they then decorated with a lot of this Native American art. Well, along comes Eric, their son, in the late 1800s, and this love of Native American culture and art and people just transferred to him. And so he grew up with this love as well. Well, in about the time he was in his early 20s, he was starting to figure out, what am I going to do in life? Because he loved not only Native American art, but creating art. But he wasn't very good at it. He could do these self-portraits and he would do some paintings of landscapes and things. But people started to realize that, he's got some skill, but he'll never make it as an artist. Well, he was having this, what was called a corn camp supper outside of this home in Evergreen. And they would invite the neighbors over, and it was very cowboy-like. They would even put on chaps and vests and hats, and, they looked the whole deal. And there was this woman who was a neighbor of theirs. Her name was Ann Evans. And she was the daughter of a pretty infamous Colorado governor you may or may not have heard of, named Governor Evans. He was infamously associated with the Sand Creek Massacre, one of the worst atrocities that was committed not only in Colorado but in the nation's history. And because of that, I am convinced was on this mission to try to pay back what had happened through her father and
Rehabilitate his memory, the family tradition.
and all of those people. And so she wanted to honor the Native Americans, not only those who had died at Sand Creek, but just, throughout that part of, the West. She was convinced that a lot of that culture was in danger of fading away because of what white America had done to these Native people, putting them on reservations, the atrocities that were reflected in Sand Creek and other places. And she wanted to start a museum which specialized in Native American art. She really thought that I need to, try to do what I can to preserve this art before it is lost to history.
Preserve the history, yeah.
Yeah, that's what they really thought. And so she approached Eric at this supper and said, "I've got this idea. I want to see if you would help me by launching this museum." And so it was the Denver Art Museum, and the Native Arts Department is what it's called now, but back then it was the Indian Arts Department. And she pretty much entrusted Eric, my grandfather, to go and convince these Native artists that their work needed to be in this museum, which a lot of them didn't understand the concept.
Yeah.
But he went on this mission, with the help of his father, who knew a lot of these artists and got them connected, and purchased a lot of pottery, textiles, sand paintings, beautiful pieces of art, and put them in a museum, which was unheard of at the time. We're talking like 1930s.
What was the reaction at the time? Was a negative reaction, or did?
I think there was some open-mindedness, but there was a lot of racism, a lot of prejudice. Also, a lot of people thought that this truly wasn't art; that it's something you buy at a road stand, in southern Colorado or northern New Mexico or in Arizona. And so he was fighting the tide a little bit, but he made it really his passion was to elevate this art and to put it in the same status as a beautiful French Renaissance painting or a piece of statuary from Greece. And he worked tirelessly to convince people this is art from, ages ago that's been around for thousands of years. And it is beautiful, and it's not to be trapped under glass. He liked to use that term because for many, many years, people studied this art as strictly ethnographic. It's
like
just
archaeologist or something.
Yeah, exactly. And he was trying to turn that around and put it on its head by saying, no, this is not only art that tells the tale of a nation, of a culture, but it is also living art that can beautify your home. And so that was what he did with the Indian Arts Department. And in addition to getting these connections with these artists, he also developed some techniques to showcase the art in ways that are still today in use by museums.
Revolutionary, like
throughout the world.
With the standard, right? To actually represent that type of art, which I guess it's not the same as European art. It's a different type of art.
Do you have a favorite museum that you like to go to?
Well, I live in New England, so I go to Boston, a lot. Though in New Hampshire, we have art museums. My daughter is a graphic sequential artist. Oh, wow. So she gets a lot of her work in the galleries, and she does a lot of work in virtual galleries all over the world. But
well, the reason I ask that is I want to give you some examples of the types of display innovation that Poppy came up with during his career. So if you go in a museum today, you probably will still find stuff that will be behind cabinetry or glass if it's really highly valuable, or if there's concern that it, might be vandalized or something.
Touch it. You don't want people touching it.
but there are other examples where it's right there in front of you, and that is what Eric Douglas wanted to do.
Out in the open air, and it's just in front of you.
Break it out from the display cases, put it on pedestals, adjust lighting so that it looks dramatic, and paint the backgrounds. Very simple thing to do.
Oh, yeah.
But will the background match the piece of art? And I'll give you an example. There was a Hopi potter named Nampayo, and she was just highly gifted. And later in life, it got to the point she had sort of an eye disease that made it very hard for her to make her pottery. So she depended on her daughter to help finish a lot of the work. But for many, many years, she did it on her own. And she lived in a place called Hano, First Mesa in Arizona, Hopi land. Mm-hmm. And if you can imagine in your mind, these adobe boxes on top of a mesa that ladders are up the side, that is the kind of village that she and her family lived in. And they were part of the Corn Clan, is what they called themselves. And so she made this seed pot for Eric to put in the Denver Art Museum. And her technique was really interesting because she would scrounge around at the base of this mesa for shards of pots from hundreds, sometimes thousands of years earlier that her ancestors would discard after the pot was done. And she would copy those designs. And so in her contemporary time,
bring back
late 1800s, early 1900s, incorporate those designs. She was known for what was called the migration pattern, because a lot of the designs looked like birds in flight, like they were migrating. Awesome. At any rate, so Eric had this seed jar, and when he put it in the museum, he wanted to reflect the area from which it came. And Nampayo preferred the clay at the base of this mesa because it was yellow. And it just had a special finish to it by the time she fired it and everything. And she used really ancient techniques, sheep bones and dung, to fire the pots. And so he made sure that the backgrounds were painted to reflect where the object came from.
Oh, wow.
Sounds simple.
Yeah,
but again, it was revolutionary.
Yeah.
And at the time, a lot of museums, they were just white walls, cabinets up against a wall, little tiny descriptions that were typewritten, and you really had to look hard to understand where it was. So he wanted to just make sure that that went away, and he made it more interactive and interesting. He teamed up with a guy in New York who was kind of on a similar path. They were both visionaries. His name was René de Harnecourt at the Museum of Modern Art. And what René did, he sketched out what would a museum visitor see when they walk through this gallery. And he would just take a piece of graph paper, and he was a very talented artist, and he would sketch out, okay, over here you see this urn, over here you see this painting, there's so much space here, let's raise this pot up on a pedestal, let's put some lighting on this mask here so it looks like it's being lit by firelight.
We just storyboarded the whole thing out to have the layout.
That's a great way to put it. That was a storyboard. I never thought about that. That's brilliant.
Yeah, that's the way I look at it.
Yeah, but that's what he did. And so Eric, learned of his techniques and adopted them at the Denver Art Museum. And the two of them teamed up on a couple of really big exhibitions in their day. One was in San Francisco. A lot of people have never heard of this, but in 1939, there was the Golden Gate Expo, and it was held to celebrate the opening of the Golden Gate Bridge. And what they did, the Army Corps of Engineers, it sounds nuts, but it's true, built an artificial island in San Francisco Bay. And on top of this island, they put this exhibition space. It was like a World's Fair.
Wow.
And the only way you could get out there is by water taxi.
boat. Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's no longer there.
So it
But
disappeared after a time, right? It just
yeah, but when it was in its prime and when it was open, they called it Magic City because there were multicolored spotlights. Think about this. If you've been in San Francisco and you're looking out in the bay, kind of like if you're going to see Alcatraz,
yeah,
but
yeah.
then there's this
You see
there's
that
this
one?
there's this other island.
Are there
And
photographs of that?
there are actually, if you will look for Golden Gate Expo, and there's some also really cool artwork from the time, but they had
Yeah,
these
maybe I can check that.
multicolored searchlights that shot hundreds of feet up into the air on this artificial island. And so that's why they called it Magic City, because at night it just had this glow to it. And so Eric and Renee were asked by the Works Progress Administration, which was helping with a lot of people get jobs during the Great Depression.
WPA, yeah.
Yeah, WPA money was used to help with this, to design what they called the Indian Court, because they wanted to take a lot of Native American art and showcase it on this island as part of this expo. And so they worked on that for many, many months, and it was a smash hit. And the other thing they made sure to do, which was also a hallmark of both Poppy and this man, Renee, they brought in the artists to demonstrate how they made these beautiful things.
Was that revolutionary to actually have the artist there? Is that
Absolutely.
something that had really been done?
It had not. It had not. And so, you would have these sand painters or these pottery makers like Nampayot. You had textile artists. One in particular that I just love through the research I did on her was Mary Bear Inkanish. And she was a Southern Cheyenne craftswoman. And she would do these beautiful buckskin dresses and moccasins. And she did it the old way at a time when, again, that was starting to fall out of favor. I've never done it myself, but if you can imagine trying to punch through deer skin.
It must be tough.
With an awl or, just the work it takes on your fingers. And she would tan it. Again, using like the brains of animals for the acid that would help with working with the material.
Really old school, doing it the old way.
And the beading. Think of that. If you've ever looked at anything that is beaded, and her moccasins, the ones that she would do, some of them were beaded on both the top and the bottom, particularly if it was a ritual that had sacred meaning to the tribe, to the individual that was the focus of this ritual. For example, a funeral. In her culture, the deceased was carried, and you didn't want, obviously, the moccasins would not be used by the person, but by wearing them with this beautiful beading on the top and the bottom, and you're carrying them through to the procession and to the final resting place. It was a beautiful way to express that person's individuality and their soul. Also for weddings, a lot of the time the bride was also carried rather than walked. And so that was why that beading was done on the moccasins. Well, anyway, Mary Little Bear, she was invited to demonstrate. And I have this incident in my book, which is based, everything in there happened. I had to invent a couple of things to fill in some gaps and a couple of characters, but everything that happened in there is based on real events. And one of them happened at this Golden Gate Expo. So Eric and Renee open up this Indian court. They're just starting to get traffic through and starting to, let people know in San Francisco who are coming here, hey, this is a cool thing to come see. This Mary Little Bear comes up to them, and she has a very unusual request. She says, she called him Douglas. His name was Douglas, but her name for him, she couldn't quite pronounce the last name, so it was Douglas. She said, Douglas, I need help. There's a little girl here. Her name is Dolly Lee, and she has a bad leg. And her father wants to try some traditional medicine to help with her bad leg. The traditional medicine involved a sand painting. Sand paintings were and are not only beautiful, but they're also sacred, and they're used in healing. There are specific colors and specific designs that the whoever is making the sand painting, they invoke help from the gods to help the individual. And so in the case of this little girl, they wanted to use some of this traditional method to help with her leg, with her bad leg. And so Eric and Renee had to call Washington to get them to shut down the Indian court for a night so the medicine man could come in and create this sacred sand painting so this little girl could sit on it. They could do the ritual they needed to do and then tear up the sand painting using, just this colored sand that they had, which was then sprinkled onto the girl. And it all had to be done by sunrise. That was just, how they did this ritual. And so at great expense, Eric and Renee got Washington to say, okay, after this place just opened up, and they closed down the Indian Hall so Dolly Lee could get this healing, and it helped her leg. It's amazing.
Well, that's super respectful in a time that you would think that maybe people wouldn't be that respectful.
Exactly.
So that's kind of an odd story, because given the time frame or the mindset, being an African American, I kind of understand the mindset at that time.
Mm-hmm. No question.
And it's like how that's very progressive to have that happen.
Well, and the other thing about it is the racist attitudes that were in effect at that time. A lot of it was fostered by Hollywood. These stereotypical views of Native Americans, always fighting the white settler, the squaw, very offensive. Just a lot of those tropes were very much in evidence. Yeah. And so, for Poppy and for the people that he connected with, that was also part of his mission, was to overcome those stereotypes and to be respectful, to the extent of even, well, let's close down the museum if you want to do this ritual, in hopes that it will help this little girl. And I'll give you one more example just on the display innovation. At this same event in San Francisco, they had a muralist come in and paint this war party on a wall, writing across the plains. And rather than just leave it as this flat mural, my grandfather had the idea of making it 3D.
Oh, wow.
And so they ended up, and don't ask me how, but they would implant feathers on the chief at the head of this war party. And then they piped a bit of compressed air through a rubber hose hidden off to the side, so that the feathers rippled as if this chief was going through wind. And again, think about that, 1939.
Well, yeah, that's a very advanced technique and very forward thinking.
Even by today's standards.
Yeah, but I've never even seen anybody try something like that. I mean, maybe somewhere that somebody's done that, but
well, maybe we gave somebody an idea.
Back. Well, you always find in the past, you find these things. You look at history, which is I always love looking at history. You find these nuggets of knowledge and interesting things. It's like, wow. It's like, to me, it's like you should always kind of review the past to kind of know where we are and where we could be.
Well, I think if we do not study the past, we're doomed to repeat it. Right?
Yeah, well, we're living in that right now.
Yes, indeed we are. Can I give you one more example?
Yeah.
So Renee and Eric teamed up again in the early 40s at MoMA, at the Museum of Modern Art. And they took the lessons that they learned at the San Francisco Expo, at the Golden Gate Expo, and applied it. And what they did in New York at that other exhibit devoted to Native American art, they brought in kiva masters from Arizona, from Hopi and Hopi land. And if you've ever been in a kiva, It is a vast space underground that's only accessible by a ladder. You have to climb down the ladder to go into the space where rituals are performed. And so, working with these kiva masters, with these artists, they replicated kivas in the Museum of Modern Art for this exhibit, and then would have these same artists paint these beautiful pictographs, which are often found on the sides of cliffs here in Colorado and in other places, to depict animals and chapters of stories in a particular tribe's history. And Eleanor Roosevelt was one of the VIPs who attended this MoMA exhibit, and she was so impressed by what they had done and the extent of knowledge that was on view and the interactivity involving the artists that she complimented them both. She wrote this beautiful letter to them expressing how much this meant to the country to have this art showcased in that way. So they made quite a team, and in the process, I think left an enduring legacy in terms of museum display methods.
And once Eleanor wrote that, then that must have worldwide acknowledgement of what Poppy was doing, right?
Well, I think for a time he was very, what kind of put a dent in it was his World War II service. Because when the war broke out, he, because of his expertise in administration from the museum, and he had been in World War I briefly as a very young man, but he stepped up, he volunteered and said, I don't know what you guys need, but here's what I can do. I'm pretty good at organizing stuff. And they made him the administrator of a hospital in the South Pacific during World War II and put him in charge of over 100 nurses. And he went to New Hebrides, and he and these nurses were on the front lines of just horrific, battle casualties.
Really bad. Yeah, that was.
And a lot of the injuries were not the type that was on the surface. Back then, they called it shell shock. Today, we call it PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
And Eric, to his credit, because of his father's interest in, sacred music, religious music for the Episcopal Church, I think somehow figured out intuitively that just like art, music had the power to heal.
Yeah, that's a very interesting dynamic.
Yeah, and so he, again, innovator, he decided that he would organize these convalescing shell shock patients into choirs at this hospital in the Philippines.
So music therapy, like art therapy, music therapy. That's like something in the 60s people kind of know about. He's doing that in the 40s.
He was doing that in the 40s, and he would write back home to Evergreen and ask his dad, hey, can you send me some choral pieces that I can teach these guys? Because it seems to be having a good effect. And it was funny, these nurses kind of mangled his name because the family name was Poppy for Eric. Yeah. Somehow it became Pappy in the South Pacific.
Well, maybe that's what, maybe the popular term Pappy was more known.
Yeah.
So they had switched it to something they were comfortable with.
I have no idea how it happened, but he became Pappy, and unfortunately, for whatever reason, they became his chicks. That's how he called them, because he felt like they were, chicks he had to help and make sure that they were okay and protected. So it was Pappy and his chicks. And they bonded as people often do in war. Mm. And that friendship and that bond lasted for the rest of his life. And at the end of their service together in the Philippines, he wrote verses for every one of these nurses, as sort of a memento for them to carry, because awesome. He just loved them and they loved him back. And they had reunions almost every year after the war until he died.
Well, the nature of being a creative is that you can, you kind of can deal with the present moment in the moment and figure out how art can be intertwined into life. And it
Absolutely.
seems like he being a curator and a musician, but and somebody that understands art and appreciates art, and whether or not he was going to be famous as an artist himself, he still ended up contributing to the field of art.
And I'll tell you what, Phantom, he packed a lot into a pretty short life. He was only 58 when he got bone cancer. And it was a very, very painful bone cancer. At these reunions with these nurses, he never really let on how bad it was. And it took him quickly. It also took an arm. And that's my memory of my grandfather. I only knew him when I was a 2-year-old.
Wow.
And you know how it is when you're a kid, you have just little flashes of memory.
Yeah.
And my memory of Poppy was this tall, one-armed, scary giant. And again, didn't know a whole lot about him then or for many, many years later. But doing this book, boy, I sure got to know him.
You kind of worked back into it. You kind of reverse engineered it.
And I want to add something because I think this is great that you've titled this, Changing White Attitudes About Native American Art, because he did do something else that I think through a 2025 lens is going to seem very controversial. Mm-hmm. But I think his heart was in the right place. So as I've indicated, he was always trying to come up with these creative ways to introduce the white world to Native Americans and Native American art. So in the case of textiles, dresses, moccasins, leggings, he thought, it's so static to see this stuff on a mannequin, when you go into a museum. So how about, and I think my grandmother, whom I referenced earlier, I think she maybe planted the seed a little bit for this. He thought, why not put on a live fashion show?
Wow.
And, dresses from way back from the 1800s through then contemporary designs from the 1940s and 50s. And what is the best audience for this? Well, let's go to the high society social types, because if I'm going to start changing attitudes, a lot of the time, maybe this is a good place to
top down.
to get top down. Well, here's the controversial part. He used white models wearing Native American textiles to do these fashion shows in front of these women's groups in Denver. But the shows were a hit. He narrated them like Vogue magazine. Mm-hmm. He would compare this one dress, this Cheyenne dress. He said, this is sort of their version of the little black dress you wear at a cocktail party. But at the same time, he would be careful in just, how respectfully he tried to tell them why this art was important and the craftsmanship and why this was such a beautiful piece of art, and to think of it as art. And these shows, I'm telling you, they were staged all over the country, in Phoenix and Hollywood and the East Coast. And eventually they kind of, again, you can probably look at this as cultural appropriation, but a lot of designers, if you look back at some of the fashion from the late 40s and into the 50s, started incorporating Native American designs
in their art.
If you look at
happens all the time.
Absolutely. And I think these shows influenced a lot of these designers. So, that's, again, through 2025.
Like art, you think about African American, like blues, jazz, Delta blues, is like influences like all the forms, like rock, and all the forms comes from like Lead Belly, Absolutely. Robert Johnson, all those guys. It's coming from that. It's coming from that kind of African American tradition in art, and then people would appropriate it because that's what happens. But that's just the nature. And I would say the constraints at the time probably didn't even get into the mindset, though. Maybe you should have a Native American actually wear the dress.
Exactly.
I can understand it.
I through my research, he did attempt to do it, but there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm there for them to to do that. And I don't know how hard he really pushed to do it, frankly, either. But he
Mhm.
felt like, okay, if I'm going to change attitudes and I'm going to, as you said, do it top down at the time, then maybe they'll be more comfortable seeing, their own,
Yeah,
themselves
yeah.
reflected in this art. But yeah, that was a big part of his last few years with the Denver Art Museum were these fashion shows. And I'm told that there are some scraps of film that still
Exists from that
exist
period. From that period.
showing this fashion show. All I've been able to track down so far through the Denver Art Museum, who I've got to say really opened up their archives to me when I was there. They rolled out these boxes and boxes. He was a prolific letter writer and diary keeper, which was great for me as a writer. But they also included these Kodachrome slides of these fashion shows. So I have stills, color stills from the 50s. But yeah, my elusive goal is to maybe find that little piece of film if it exists.
Have you thought of taking your book and maybe turning it into another form, like a documentary film, or has anybody approached you to look at it from a film perspective?
I will tell you, I had a TV life before I was an author, and I worked as a multimedia journalist and an executive producer for the NBC station here in
Yeah, that's what I
Denver.
was wondering. Like, would you want to take that skill set and maybe do that?
We did a series called Colorado Pioneers, and I had my turn to talk about this part of my life and my family, and I did do a series. But again,
Amazing.
it wasn't a big budget thing. It's just me and a photog, and some interviews and some archival footage. I've often thought there is a cinematic aspect to his life and all that
Yeah,
he
it seems
did
like it from what you're telling me.
and all the people that he interacted with. And I don't know, I
The
mean,
whole scene of the Golden Gate. Yeah, I can't. I
yeah.
was kind of like I'm a very like well, I'm a musician, but I think in terms of like sound paintings. So when you tell a story, I start to visualize it.
Mm.
And when you told me about that island, I said, "Wow, that would look really great on film."
Well,
Yeah.
if maybe somebody's hearing this and wants to give it a try, my main thing was I wrote this really for my family. I
Mhm.
was very concerned that, his legacy, his history
We get lost.
was going to get lost. Almost like, Ann Evans thought that a lot of Native Americans would get lost to history, and look how wrong she was. But honestly, there was for a long time a society dedicated to my grandfather called the Douglas Society at the Denver Art Museum. And this is the other interesting aspect of this. As I told you at the beginning, I really didn't know a lot about him. And my grandmother, didn't really talk a lot about that part of her life, except for one day, I'll never forget. She brought in this supplement to the Denver Post, and it was called Empire Magazine. And the cover was about their beautiful home in Evergreen and the history of the Douglas family. And she handed it to me. Again, I'm a teenager, and said, "You may want to hang on to this because it's about your grandfather and about us when we
Wow. So you
were
thought
up
you were
there."
ready at that point to tell you?
Well, I think she just wanted to make sure I had it, that maybe
Mhm.
someday I'd appreciate it. Well, many, many years later, after she had passed and I had my busy TV life, I get this call out of the blue from the Denver Art Museum. I don't know how they tracked me down as one of the last living descendants of Eric Douglas. And they said, "Hey, we have this society. Did you know that?" And I said, "No, I didn't." I said, "Well, we'd love you to do a lecture about your grandfather."
Oh, so that's the start.
Oh, I was just terrified. I mean, I have a magazine article and scraps and bits and pieces about the guy. Somehow, I don't know how, I put together a 90-minute lecture, a lot of multimedia from,
Mhm.
again, what I had done at 9 with just the series and things. But again, I had no depth of knowledge of him.
Mhm.
And so at the end of that 90-minute lecture, and they told me it went well. I think they were just being nice, but I did my best. At that point is when I believe it started to form in my mind that, I need to
Get
write
a
about
deeper
this
dive.
guy.
Get the deeper dive and
Yeah.
actually.
And so I retired from TV in 2014. I had another 7 years as a multimedia journalist for a school district here in Colorado. Again, the storytelling was at that point all based on, what we typically do in news, in broadcast news. So a lot of short sentences. We always like to say, write like people talk.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I retired in 21, that's when it occurred to me, well, okay, let's try to unlearn all of the TV and
Go
and
into more
try
depth for a book.
and try to see if I can handle it as a book. And that's what I did, and thankfully it's been well received. And I want to say one more thing, Phantom. What also motivated this was the sudden and unexpected death of my beautiful Becky, my wife. We were together for almost 49 years, and she passed away of a brain aneurysm. And there was a religious aspect to it as well, which I won't go into, but is actually the subject of my second book, which I'm writing right now.
We write another book. Okay.
And you can look at loss if you're a creative, which I know you are, and a lot of your listeners are. You can look at loss as something to really crush you, or you can look at it for the gold that it can provide in being that creative fuel.
Yeah, it is the fuel. I mean, it can be very traumatic, and a lot of times a crucible moment. Mm-hmm. I've talked to a lot of artists, and it's those crucible moments that we can channel as artists, and we can channel into whatever art we're into, and then people feel the vulnerability, they feel the passion, they feel the authenticity that you bring to it, because you have that ability to synthesize like what's inside, what's outside, what's in the moment. And that's the quality of like why creativity, I think, is a very human thing in a world that's going so much into tech. That, and especially within Native American and Indigenous, because I'm part Blackfoot and Cherokee. And the idea that, that spirit and heart and soul will be replaced by the machine. Mm-hmm. Kind of like, probably not.
Well, I'll tell you, it was my grief project. We all process grief differently. But for me, being able to immerse myself in this world of Native American art and all of these beautiful people that intersected with Poppy throughout his life gave me purpose, and it prevented me from falling down that hole that was so easy to fall into.
Yeah, because I mean, if you can take the things that happen, like, death is a really hard thing to deal with. I lost my pop to Alzheimer's, like back in 2017, and it was unexpected because I didn't realize it was going that way. And so you start to realize how important moments are, moments that you capture with people, and actually being able to, document your life. Right. And you found the importance of documenting the history of Poppy, and I think that is a lot of things people miss, they don't realize until it's gone.
Yeah.
And then they didn't know, well, how do I capture it? I just have a memory, but at least you put the work in that more than just a memory.
Well, I know that I did my best, and it's there for my family, number one, which I am glad that I did. And then by extension, anyone else that has this interest in Native American art, in the way it's displayed in just that period of history, it's out there, and I hope people continue to enjoy it.
Well, I think it's real important because it's like the American experience is not just one dimensional. American experience, it's Native Americans, Chinese Americans, African Americans, it's a melting pot.
Yeah.
And we're kind of being told today that we don't have to look at it that way. And I think it's really tragic, especially with Indigenous peoples. It's like there's a lot of history that we don't learn. Like, I went to college and I was able to go and learn in college, but our public education system doesn't really tell you a lot about what the history of America is. except for certain perspectives, and to dive into the other stories. I think all the stories you can get. I think as a person, as an American, I think it's important for people to dive in and find out about all the different indigenous cultures all over the United States, and even the Americas, going
They
into South
were
America too.
they were here a lot longer than anybody else, and they will be here a lot longer than anybody else. My grandfather said that. So
There's a lot to learn.
there's
And
a
they-
lot. There's a lot there.
yeah, there's definitely a lot to learn. It's like you taught me a lot of things today in
Good.
terms of the perspective and the type of art and the kind of performance of it, with the sand paintings and the actual use, medicinal use of it, and the spiritual and connection that indigenous people have to practices. A lot of people look to the east, but like we're in a place that has very similar. Big people go to Japan, they go to China, they used to find things. It's like you can find things like that in America.
Absolutely.
But you're not even looking. You're going. You don't have to travel over the ocean to get to that. You can get to it here.
I must tell you, I wish we had more time, because there's another neat story that we'll just have to save for now. But I was given the opportunity as part of the research for this book to enter a canyon that is off limits to most people, so that I could go in the backcountry of it's near Kayenta down in the southwest, and to be able to go to these sacred places that very few people have ever seen. Some are burial sites, and they've been untouched for hundreds and hundreds of years. And there is something about being in a place like that. When you talk about sacredness, you feel it.
Yeah, that's the vibration and this energy. There's frequency, and you can get tapped into, the universe. You get tapped into Gaia. You get tapped into the planet. You get tapped into the spirits of our ancestors. And that kind of energy, people are looking for it, and you can find it in the Americas.
You can.
I think that's a lesson learned today. And I'd love to have you come back on. If you mentioned you're writing another book, we have people come back, especially authors, when they're working on other things or they want to dive deeper into something. We have that opportunity. So we do, because we do have another show coming up. I wish I didn't, but I do. But that's something we can look forward to. And I want you do have your is that your publisher below the?
It's sandgoatmanorpublishing.com. It's a mouthful, sandgoatmanorpublishing.com. But if you go there, obviously you can get the book through that site. But also I've got some. You mentioned the multimedia. I've got some of that I've done. Cool. On Poppy and that home in Evergreen. So please check it out. There's a photo gallery. A lot of the stuff I've referenced, you will see pictures of all that.
That's awesome, because that will be fully clickable. And we've just been on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch. Within the podcast description of those platforms, you'll be able to click through right on that immediately and go right to that site. We're going to be on all the other podcast platforms that you want to listen to or watch a podcast. There'll be a landing page available by tomorrow. I want to thank you for being a guest on the Family Like It Goes podcast tonight. It's been greatly illuminating. And I love to talk to people who are creative and dive deep. And history is really big. I'm a history buff, so this is really awesome.
Phantom, you're a great host and a great listener, and I appreciate the time you've given me.
Oh, I'm very much into it. I'm going to check out that San Francisco Island.
Good.
Yeah, I want to see that.
Good.
On top of the rest of your material there, I'm going to be going there later tonight. But thank you again. Thank you, and have a great night.
You too, sir.